As the clock struck noon on February the 18th, 1944, the citizens of Amiens in France heard an ominous rumbling in the air and the crackling of anti-aircraft guns. Suddenly, from a blustery, overcast sky, burst a flight of British de Havilland Mosquito light bombers. Roaring along at treetop level, the aircraft followed the long, straight Avenue de la Défense Passive toward their target, the looming brick and concrete hulk of Amiens prison. A series of deafening blasts ripped through the air, and within minutes the aircraft were gone, leaving the prison walls a smoking ruin. In the ensuing chaos, hundreds of prisoners, many of them members of the French resistance, clambered out through the breaches and into the safety of the countryside, free to continue the fight against the occupying Nazis. Ramrod 564, better known as Operation Jericho, was one of the most daring air raids of the Second World War, dramatically showcasing the Royal Air Force's ability to carry out pinpoint strikes and work in concert with Allied resistance movements. But over the past 80 years, the operation has become the subject of considerable controversy, with historians questioning whether it was worth the considerable collateral damage inflicted and even the motivations for the raid itself. Just before we continue with the episode today, big thank you to our fantastic sponsor, and that is Squarespace. Look, building a website shouldn't be a headache. I mean, it used to be. I remember doing Computer Club or whatever in the 90s. Late 90s, early 2000s, and we were making websites with HTML, and they looked terrible, and it was an enormous hassle. Well, no longer thanks to Squarespace. Look, whether you're launching a business, showcasing your work, or selling online, Squarespace gives you everything you need. No coding required. With Design Intelligence, Squarespace's AI-powered tool helps you build a unique professional site in just minutes. Squarespace Payments lets you accept payments seamlessly with options like Apple Pay and Klarna. And if you want to grow your audience, there's email campaigns which let you send beautifully designed emails, automate follow-ups, and boost engagement, all from your website. So you can start your free trial today at squarespace.com/brainfood. And when you're ready to launch, use the code BRAINFOOD and you'll save 10% off your first purchase, which is nice. Squarespace, everything you need to bring your ideas to life. Thanks to them for sponsoring. And now back to today's episode. This is the story of one of World War II's most contentious aerial operations. Straddling the banks of the Somme River 120 kilometers north of Paris, the city of Amiens has long been of vital strategic importance, being besieged and occupied by dozens of invaders over the centuries, including the Romans during the Gallic Wars and the Spanish during the 1595 to 1598 Franco-Spanish War. During the First World War, the city served as headquarters for the Entente powers during the 1916 Battle of the Somme, while on August 8, 1918, the Battle of Amiens kicked off what would become known as the 100 Days Offensive that ultimately led to the November 11th armistice and the end of the war. Amiens was of equal, if not greater importance to both sides during the Second World War, being a major railway transport hub in northern France. As a result, the city's rail yards were extensively bombed by Allied aircraft. In late 1943 and 1944, the city and the surrounding area came under increased scrutiny by Allied military planners. The upcoming Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, codenamed Operation Overlord, would be landed on the beaches of Normandy between Cherbourg and Le Havre. However, to divert enemy forces, the Allies conducted a massive deception campaign codenamed Operation Bodyguard to fool the Germans into thinking the landings would instead take place at the Pas de Calais, the closest point in France to the British Isles. As Amiens lay between Calais and both Paris and Normandy, knowledge of the area would be vital to slowing the advance of German reinforcements. Amiens was also a major staging area for the German V-weapons campaign, which would soon be raining hundreds of deadly V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic missiles down on London and other cities. To gather information and carry out sabotage operations against German forces, the Allies turned to the French resistance, a loose organization of citizens of varying backgrounds and political affiliations, working towards the common goal of ending the Nazi occupation. Resistance informants supplied intelligence on enemy troop movements and military installations to Allied organizations such as the British MI6 and Special Operations Executive, or SOE, and the American Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, who in turn supplied resistance groups with weapons, explosives, and other supplies via clandestine parachute drops. However, not all was as it seemed. Unbeknownst to Allied intelligence agencies, the Germans had been ruthlessly efficient in rooting out and shutting down resistance cells across the country. Aided by milice agents of the collaborationist Vichy regime, as well as local informants, in 1943 alone, German police and intelligence organizations like the Gestapo, Abwehr, and Sicherheitsdienst succeeded in arresting over 1,500 resistance members and Allied secret agents, most of whom were deported to concentration camps in Germany for torture and execution. Many captured radio operators or their wireless sets were turned by the Germans and used to transmit false intelligence and supply requests back to their handlers, duping the Allies into dropping dozens of agents and countless tons of equipment straight into German hands. The Germans nicknamed this tactic Funkspiel, or the radio game. As a result of these operations, by late 1943, 7 out of 10 radio operators around Paris had been captured or turned, and total resistance reports across France had fallen by half, choking off the flow of vital intelligence to Allied forces. The situation came to a head in October 1943 with the arrest of Roland Farian, a leading member of the Organisation Civile et Militaire, or OCM, which set off a chain of mass arrests that netted some 12,000 resistance members in the Amiens region alone. Among them was Raymond Vivant, sub-prefect for Abbeville, who was arrested on February 14, 1944, and interned at Amiens prison. Vivant had organised a network of informants to gather information on German coastal defences and deliver it to village mayors, who then conveyed it to Vivant for transmission by radio to London. He was thus uniquely knowledgeable about Operation Overlord and could potentially compromise the whole invasion if he cracked under torture. Some 700 other resistance members were also being held in Amiens prison, including 2 American and 1 British secret agent. Worse still, reports soon reached Allied intelligence that on August 2, 1943, 11 resistance members had been shot at the nearby Amiens citadel, and that a further 100 were scheduled for execution on February 19, 1944. Resistance leader Dominique Ponchardier thus contacted MI6, SOE, and OSS requesting a raid on the prison to free Vivant and the other prisoners. The British War Office agreed, and with little time remaining before the executions, planning for the operation, codenamed Ramrod 564, began immediately. SOE and OSS began contacting the few resistance agents still active around Amiens, while MI19, the Escape and Evasion Department of British Military Intelligence, began gathering as much information as it could about the prison and the surrounding area. Over in France, resistance members began scouting out Amiens prison to determine if a ground assault was feasible. One agent, Maurice Holville, obtained a permit to deliver parcels to the prison, using his time inside to sketch out the building's layout and study the routines of guard and prisoner movements. Meanwhile, another agent attempted to gauge the thickness and construction of the outer walls by pretending to kiss his girlfriend outside them. This information was written down on 2 separate sets of papers, one of which was retained by the local resistance leader and the other given to an agent codenamed Sergei for transmission to the Allies. This proved a prudent move, for Sergei was soon arrested and summarily executed by the agents of the milice. His documents were passed on to the German authorities, who reinforced the prison's guard detail with 80 troops and installed a machine gun nest in the courtyard. With the ground assault on the prison now rendered suicidal, only one option remained: an aerial bombardment to breach the prison walls. But there was a problem. The prison was a small target, surrounded on all sides by densely populated urban areas. Carrying out such a raid while minimizing civilian casualties would require a high level of precision. Thankfully, the Royal Air Force had just the aircraft for the job, the legendary de Havilland Mosquito. Designed to minimize consumption of scarce strategic materials like aluminium, the Mosquito was largely built of laminated plywood, a technique de Havilland pioneered with its record-breaking DH-88 Comet race plane. And to learn more about that incredible aircraft, please do check out our previous video, The Greatest Air Race of All Time, that helped develop the global airline industry. But unusually for a machine born of wartime desperation, the Mozzie, or Wooden Wonder as it was affectionately known, quickly became one of the most successful and versatile aircraft of the Second World War. First entering service in 1941, the Mosquito was used in dozens of different roles, including light bomber, night fighter, maritime strike aircraft, photo reconnaissance platform, and high-speed VIP transport. Indeed, in October 1943, famous Danish physicist Niels Bohr was smuggled out of Denmark in the bomb bay of a specially modified Mosquito. Much of the aircraft's success was due to its tremendous speed. Powered by a pair of 1,710 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 engines, the Mosquito had a top speed of nearly 700 km per hour, about 430 miles per hour, allowing it to outrun nearly anything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. Indeed, despite having no defensive armament whatsoever, the speedy Mozzie even enjoyed the highest survival rate of any Allied bomber of the Second World War. This speed and maneuverability, along with its ability to carry a wide variety of ordnance, made the aircraft perfect for precision strikes against small, difficult-to-reach targets. For example, on September 25, 1942, 4 Mosquitoes of No. 105 Squadron RAF carried out a raid on the Gestapo's Norwegian headquarters located in the Victoria Terrasse building in downtown Oslo. The raid, designed to boost the morale of the Norwegian people, was deemed successful enough for the RAF to reveal the existence of the Mosquito to the British public. By the war's end, the RAF would carry out 2 more precision raids against Gestapo headquarters in Aarhus, Denmark on October 31st, 1944, and Copenhagen on March 21st, 1945, but those are stories for another video. In preparation for the Amiens raid, RAF photo reconnaissance aircraft flew multiple sorties over the prison. Located along the highway connecting Amiens to the town of Albert to the northeast, the main prison building was a cruciform structure, 130 meters along the north side, 120 meters long on the south side, 200 meters wide, 90 meters tall. This was, in turn, surrounded by a 3.4 meter high rectangular wall. According to information supplied by the resistance, the cell blocks were divided into 2 main sections. A German section at the northern end, where resistance members and other political prisoners were held, and a French section in the southern end, where regular criminals were imprisoned. At the time of the raid, the resistance estimated that there were around 700 prisoners total in the building. Meanwhile, the administrative areas were located in the shorter east-west wings of the prison, with the guard quarters in one end and the mess in the other. Reports from resistance agent Maurice Holville revealed that the guards left the cell blocks at noon to eat their lunch in the mess. To allow the maximum number of prisoners to escape while minimizing collateral damage, the RAF's plan called for the attacking aircraft to breach the prison's north and east walls and both ends of the cell blocks, as well as destroy the guards' quarters and mess. The weight of the bombs was carefully chosen, so the concussion would blow open the cell doors without killing the prisoners inside, while the attack was scheduled for noon to catch the guards during their midday meal. The raid would be carried out by 18 Mosquito FB-6s from 140 wing based at RAF Hunsen in Hertfordshire, 6 each from No. 21 Squadron RAF, 467 Squadron Royal New Zealand Air Force, and 464 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force. 1 camera-equipped Mosquito 4 from the film production unit would also accompany the raiders to record the operation. In addition to their regular armament of 4 20mm cannons and 4 303 caliber machine gun nests, each aircraft would be armed with 4 500-pound high-explosive bombs, 2 carried in the bomb bay and 2 under the wings. These were fitted with 11-second delay fuses to allow them to be accurately skipped along the ground into the prison walls. Though the Mosquitoes were faster than most German fighters, flying low to the ground and focusing on their targets, they'd be vulnerable to enemy attack, so escort would be provided by Hawker Typhoons from No. 174 and 245 squadrons based at RAF West Hampnet, and No. 3 and 198 squadrons based at RAF Manston. The mission was organised and directed by Air Vice Marshal Basil Embray, acting officer in command of No. 2 Group RAF. But while Embray had flown many previous missions under the pseudonym Wing Commander Smith to hide his high rank, he was denied permission to actually fly on Ramrod 564, likely because he was intimately involved in planning for Operation Overlord. Instead, the attack would be led by Command Group Captain Percy Pick Pickard, a highly experienced and decorated commander who by early 1944 had received the Distinguished Flying Cross and Distinguished Service Order with 3 bars. Prior to joining 140 Wing, Pickard had flown dozens of missions over Germany in Vickers Wellington bombers, directed the dropping of agents and supplies to the French resistance, and commanded 51 Squadron during Operation Biting, the February 27, 1942 paratrooper raid to capture a German radar in Bruneval, France, another incredible story for another video. However, Pickard was probably best known for his appearance in the Oscar-winning 1940 propaganda film Target for Tonight, in which he and his Wellington bomber F for Freddy became the faces of the British bombing effort against Germany. The raid would be carried out in 3 waves. By coin toss, 487 Squadron was chosen to lead the attack, bombing the north and east walls of the prison and the ends of the cell blocks. 464 Squadron would then follow to bomb the guards' quarters in the side wings. Meanwhile, 21 Squadron would be kept in reserve 10 minutes behind in case additional attacks were needed. At the last minute, Group Captain Pickard chose to fly the last aircraft in the second wave, allowing him to decide whether to call in 21 Squadron or order them home. The former order would be relayed by the code phrase green, 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 and the latter by red, red, red. If Pickard or his navigator, Flight Lieutenant John Broadley, were shot down or otherwise incapacitated, the order could also be given by the trailing film production unit aircraft crewed by Pilot Flight Officer Tony Wickham and cameraman Pilot Officer Lee Howard. Consequently, the attack would be led from the front by Wing Commander Irving Black Smith, no relation to Air Vice Marshal Embray's alter ego, and Navigator Flight Lieutenant P. Barnes. Back in Amiens, the French resistance made extensive preparations for the ground phase of the attack. The mother of 2 imprisoned resistance members managed to get herself arrested and locked up in Amiens prison, where she informed the prisoners about the upcoming raid and instructed them to lie flat on the floor as soon as they heard aircraft overhead. A French prison guard sympathetic to the resistance, along with one of the regular criminal prisoners, also created and tested a copy of the prison's master key and agreed to break into the prison's administrative offices during the raid to destroy the prisoner records. Meanwhile, the resistance stole or forged hundreds of ID cards, passes, and sets of clothes for the escapees, and stationed 100 Confederates around the prison, some dressed in fake SS uniforms, along with a fleet of getaway cars and bicycles. Due to the highly sensitive nature of the mission, RAF Hansen was locked down, and the Mosquito crews were not informed of their target until the absolute last minute. The raid was originally scheduled for February 17th, but a massive blizzard forced it to be scrubbed. By the 18th, the weather had not improved, but the attack could be delayed no longer. The 100 prisoners were scheduled to be executed the following day, so at 0800 hours, the pilots and navigators were gathered in the briefing room, shown a scale model of Amiens prison, and given several hours to study it and plan their routes to the target. As Wing Commander Smith later recalls, "We heard the details of this mission with considerable emotion. After 4 years of war, just doing everything possible to destroy life, here we were going to use our skill to save it. It was a grand feeling, and every pilot left the briefing room prepared to fly into the walls rather than fail to breach them. There was nothing particularly unusual in it as an operational sortie, but because of this life-saving aspect, it was to be one of the great moments in our lives." The weather that day was worse than any 140 wing had previously flown in, with low clouds and driving snow, but at around 1100 hours, all 18 Mosquitoes managed to get safely into the air. From Hunson, they turned south toward Little Hampton to rendezvous with their Typhoon escorts. On the way, 2 Mosquitoes from 21 Squadron encountered mechanical problems and were forced to return to base. Unfortunately, the rendezvous did not go as planned. Due to the weather, the commander of No. 3 Squadron refused to let any of his Typhoons take off. Meanwhile, 6 Typhoons of 198 Squadron managed to get airborne, but 3 were forced to turn back 15 minutes later after losing their formation leader in the clouds. The remaining 3 made it to France, but failed to rendezvous with the first wave as planned, though reports indicate they did link up with the second wave after they had completed their bombing run. In addition, 8 Typhoons of 174 Squadron and 6 from 245 Squadron succeeded in reaching the second and third waves, but for most of the approach and attack, the Mosquitoes were on their own. From Little Hampton, the Mosquitoes turned east and swiftly crossed the English Channel, crossing the French coast at Treetop Height. Shortly thereafter, however, the aircraft flown by Flight Lieutenant Brian Titch Hannafin and Pilot Officer C.F. Redgrave experienced overheating in one of its engines, forcing her crew to shut it down and turn back for England. After jettisoning his bombs to gain speed, Hannafin was struck by flak in the shoulder. Yet despite crippling pain, he managed to guide his aircraft back across the channel and make an emergency landing at RAF Ford near Little Hampton, where he was immediately hospitalized. Meanwhile, the remaining 60 Mosquitoes made it to Amiens unmolested. The 3 aircraft of the first wave, led by 487 Squadron Wing Commander Smith, turned southwest at the town of Albert and flew straight down the Albert-Amiens road toward the prison. As one 487 Squadron pilot later recalled, quote, "I shall never forget that road, long and straight and covered with snow. It was lined with tall poplars, and we were flying so low that I had to keep my aircraft tilted at an angle to avoid hitting the tops of the trees with my wing. The poplars suddenly petered out, and there, a mile ahead, was the goal. It looked just like the model, and within a few seconds, we were almost on top of it. So low were they flying when they released their bombs that the propeller wash threw up tall roost tails of snow behind them, and they had to pull up sharply to avoid crashing into the prison walls. The bombs skipped smoothly over the frozen ground and slammed into the east wall, blowing a massive hole in the masonry. Meanwhile, the remaining 2 Mosquitoes carried out a diversionary raid against the Amiens rail yards before returning to the prison and successfully breaching the north wall. Due to a navigation error, the first wave arrived 3 minutes late, forcing the second wave, led by 464th Squadron Wing Commander Robert Iredale, to orbit the target to avoid being caught in the first wave's bomb blasts. Unfortunately, during this delay, the second wave was pounced upon by Focke-Wulf 190 fighters based in nearby Abbeville. One fighter, flown by Feldwebel Wilhelm Meyer, attacked Group Captain Picard's aircraft, his cannon shells severing the Mosquito's tail. The aircraft crashed near Saint-Gratien, killing both Picard and his navigator, Flight Lieutenant John Bill Bradley. Another JG-26 pilot, Oberleutnant Waldemar Radner, shot down a 174 Squadron Typhoon flown by Flying Officer J.E. Renaud, who successfully crash-landed and was soon captured by the Germans. It would be years before Renaud learned that he had been shot down by a fighter. At the time, he believed that it had been hit by flak. Meanwhile, the second wave finally pressed home its attack, successfully blowing open both ends of the cell blocks and destroying the guard quarters before peeling off and heading for home. Seeing the destruction and having heard nothing from the now dead Group Captain Picard, Flight Lieutenant Tony Wickham and the trailing FPU Mosquito decided to call off the third wave, signaling 21 Squadron Wing Commander Ivor Daddy Dale with the abort code phrase, "Hello Daddy, red, red, red." He and cameraman pilot officer Lee Howard then made 3 passes to film the target before heading home themselves. During the withdrawal, the aircraft flown by 464 Squadron Leader Alan McRitchie and Flight Lieutenant Richard Sammy Sampson received a direct flak hit to the cockpit, killing Sampson and wounding McRitchie. McRitchie managed to crash land the aircraft and was soon captured by the Germans. The remaining Mosquitoes managed to escape back across the English Channel, with some landing in Hudson, but most being diverted to RAF-4 due to the weather. The last casualty of the raid was 174 Squadron Typhoon pilot Flight Sergeant Henry Brown, who was last seen near Beachy Head, then never heard from again. Total RAF casualties from the raid amounted to 2 Mosquitoes and 2 Typhoons shot down, 4 aircrew killed, and 2 taken prisoner. 3 days after Ramrod 564, 2 photo reconnaissance Mosquitoes, escorted by 4 Typhoons of 247 Squadron, returned to Amiens to record the effects of the raid. The flight encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire, with 1 Typhoon receiving a direct hit and crashing to the ground, killing its pilot, Flight Lieutenant C.E. Brayshaw. 2 other Typhoons were damaged and 1 pilot wounded. Nonetheless, thanks to the photographs returned by the mission, along with reports from French resistance, Allied intelligence was able to evaluate the effectiveness of the raid. Unfortunately, the results were mixed. While the Mosquito pilots had dropped their bombs with stunning precision, inaccurate intelligence had resulted in far greater collateral damage than expected. For example, while the resistance had estimated there were 700 inmates in the prison, the actual number was 832. And while most resistance prisoners were held in the German section of the prison, many were also housed in the French section, along with regular prisoners due to overcrowding. Other supposed regular criminals were actually resistance members arrested for regular criminal offences, but who had managed to remain incognito. Worse still, the resistance misreported the location of the prison administrative spaces actually housed in the southern end of the cell block and severely underestimated the thickness of the prison walls. As a result, many of the raiders' bombs punched straight through the walls and detonated on the other side, destroying a large section of the northern cell block and several civilian houses in the surrounding area. For example, a bomb dropped by 464 Squadron pilot K.L. Monahan overshot the prison by nearly 200 meters, destroying 3 houses at 15 to 17 Rue Voltaire and killing 40-year-old Madame Etienne Letienne. Another bomb, dropped by 487 Squadron pilot officer M.L.S. Daral, hit the St. Victor Hospice, then being used as a Luftwaffe hospital. In total, some 100 prisoners and civilians were killed and 75 wounded in the initial air raid, along with 50 German guards. But 258 managed to escape through the breaches blown in the walls and rejoin their resistance comrades waiting just outside the prison. Among those was Raymond Vivant, who later recounted his experience, quote, "I thought initially that a German plane had just crashed very close to us, and I began to delight in this, when a succession of explosions resounded. Out of instinct, I leaned myself against an angle of my cell, while the planes of the fanlight flew in fragments. I saw the wall on the left side split open abruptly, and a cloud of dust invaded my cell. I remained motionless, awaiting the end of the explosions, believing that an aerial combat had taken place above our heads. Some planes have crashed with their bomb loads, I thought. But as soon as the cloud of dust dissipated, I saw the door was torn from its hinges. The long corridor which served my cell on both floors of the prison, an immense heap of stones, had been replaced by a cluster of smoking debris. On the right-hand side, the other part of the prison appeared intact. But to the left, with inexpressible joy, I saw the countryside, covered with snow, extending to infinity. A large breach had been opened in the high surrounding wall." End quote. However, while the diversionary attack on the Amiens railway station delayed the arrival of German troops by 2 hours, when they did arrive, their response was swift and it was brutal. All but 50 of the escapees were quickly recaptured, and 260 resistance members and civilian collaborators were summarily executed in reprisal for the raid. Nonetheless, Raymond Vivant and other key resistant fighters like Jean Borin managed to escape capture and went on to provide invaluable assistance during the Operation Overlord landings in June 1944. Intelligence provided to the escapees also allowed the resistance to uncover over 60 Gestapo agents and informants hampering German counterintelligence operations in the region. Thus, despite the high casualty figures, resistance leader Dominique Ponchardier later called the Amiens prison raid, quote, "the most beautiful act of Franco-British solidarity in the whole war." But not everyone in France was as enthusiastic about the raid. 3 days after the attack, on February the 21st, the local newspaper Le Journal d'Amiens published a scathing editorial by J. Picavet reading, "The liberators passed, the gangsters of the air, for the second time in less than a month attacked Amiens on Friday. The prison was destroyed and several individual houses destroyed, with so many victims that it is not yet possible to quantify after 24 hours of clearing the debris, but it is not far from 200. Such is the scale of this aggression." "It is war," said some stubborn Anglophiles. War? With whom? Germany? Well then, in what way can this destruction and these murders hasten the end of the war? We ask this of the men of right spirit and balanced judgment. It is war, certainly, but war on the civilian population, war on our hearts, war on France. A cowardly war, because France is disarmed, a wild and barbaric war. Why was the prison so clearly targeted? Was it to deliver the elements of disorder that are the best aids to England? It is possible. But then, the goal was exceeded. They freed more than they wished. They were freed permanently. But while this article was clearly influenced by the demands of German propaganda, for decades doubts lingered as to exactly why the raid had been carried out and who had ordered it. In 2010, French historian Dr. Jean-Pierre Dusselier published a book titled The Amiens Raid: Secrets Revealed, in which he revealed that the official narrative of Ramrod 564 is full of historical inconsistencies. For instance, according to this narrative, the raid was directly requested by Dominique Ponchardier and organized through MI6 and SOE. However, in March 1944, Sir Stuart Menzies, head of MI6, sent a letter thanking the RAF for their role in the raid. But when this letter was shown to Maurice Buckmaster, head of SOE's French section, he denied having requested the attack or knowing you had. Instead, Dusselier was unable to find any evidence that the French resistance requested the attack, while all official records which might reveal who did remain classified to this day, and as an aside, throughout his career, Menzies was referred to as C and is thought to be the direct inspiration for the character of M in Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. Even more questionable is the supposed impetus for the raid, the imminent execution of 100 resistance members. At the time, executions in Amiens were very rare and typically conducted against individuals or small groups, the largest taking place on August 2, 1943, when 11 members of the resistance were shot at the nearby Amiens citadel. An execution of 100 prisoners would have been unprecedented for this part of France, yet German and French prison records, which were very thorough, reveal that no such action was planned. Indeed, the first recorded mention of the imminent executions appears in Order A0214, issued to the Royal Air Force on February 18, 1944, the same day that the raid took place. Quote, "Information. Mosquitoes of 140 airfield are to attack the prison at Amiens in an attempt to assist 120 prisoners to escape. These prisoners are French patriots condemned to death for assisting the Allies." End quote. So, if no prisoners were slated to be executed and the French resistance did not order the raid, why did the British choose to carry out such a risky operation? In his 2010 book, Dr. Dusselier puts forward a number of theories. First, he suggests that the raid's aim was not to free key resistance members like Raymond Vivant or the British and American agents interned at the prison, but rather to kill them, preventing them from revealing key intelligence about the D-Day landings. But while intriguing, this theory suffers from a number of flaws, not least of which being that such an airstrike could not be guaranteed to kill its intended targets. Indeed, the attack profile, the aircraft's bomb loads, and many other details of the operation had been carefully selected to inflict as little collateral damage as possible. Furthermore, even if the raid was a disguised assassination, it is unlikely that any agent with truly compromising knowledge of Operation Overlord would have been allowed to operate in enemy-occupied territory. Instead, Dusselier posits that the raid was intended to make the Germans think there were important secret agents or resistance members being held at the prison, emphasizing Amiens' importance to the imminent invasion of Europe and persuading the 15th Army to remain in the region. In other words, Ramrod 564 was merely a small part of the larger Operation Bodyguard deception scheme, with the freeing of prisoners and the killing of their guards just being an added bonus. In the event, the 15th Army was indeed retained in the Calais region until mid-July 1944, awaiting an expected second wave of Allied landings that never came. But with the official record still sealed, we may never know the full truth. Amiens prison still stands today, still serving its original purpose nearly a century later. Aside from the now repaired breaches still visible in its walls, the only remaining evidence of the daring 1944 raid is a commemorative limestone plaque, reading, to the French patriots killed on the 18th of February 1944 in this prison where the barbarous Nazis martyred them. And in nearby Saint-Pierre Cemetery lay the graves of Group Captain Picard and Flight Lieutenant Bradley, the most famous casualties of Ramrod 564. For his part in the daring operation, the French government recommended that Picard be posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the UK's highest award for gallantry. However, this request was turned down. Before we end the video today, you may have noticed me referring to the operation by its official name, Ramrod 564, rather than one for which is better known, Operation Jericho. While far more evocative and fitting in its imagery, this name was never officially associated with the operation and originated with a 1946 French film of the same name directed by Henri Calef, which depicted a highly fictionalized version of the 1944 raid. Indeed, the British would never have chosen such a thematically appropriate codename, the very purpose of a codename being, after all, to obscure the nature of a military operation or weapon. The Germans, by contrast, too often gave in to the temptation to choose clever, thematically appropriate codenames, much to the advantage of Allied intelligence. And to learn more about these nomenclature-based blunders, please do check out our previous videos, Death by Blue Peacock, Britain's Bizarre and Deadly Cold War Rainbow Codes, and The Forgotten Tech War. The real-life Operation Jericho also inspired another war film, 1969's Mosquito Squadron, which, like its predecessor, depicts the mission as a straightforward effort to free French resistance prisoners from a Nazi prison. But, as we've seen, the reality is far more complex, revealing the often murky and morally fraught decisions military planners must sometimes make when fighting total war.